Again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Halber, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. And the JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital and surrounding region. We represent more than 100 Jewish organizations and synagogues and institutions in our community of over 300,000, the third largest Jewish community in the United States. A key component of our work is empowering, training, and mobilizing our community to engage with and advocate for Israel. We'd like to begin today by thanking the more than 400 people from our region, Israel, and around the world who have registered for today's webinar. And I'd like to thank my friends at the New York JCRC who have partnered to promote this discussion, and to thank Adam Modesser, who is my colleague and JCRC's director of the Dr. Stuart Lesson's Israel Action Center, for arranging this seminar. Yesterday, Israelis went to the polls yet again for the fifth time in 3.5 years to exercise their right to vote. To those of us who may have been concerned about election fatigue, that proved not to be the case. The Israelis proved to be resilient. More than 70% of Israelis went out to vote, being one of the highest voting percentages in recent years. As we went into election day, polls continued to show a deadlock between the two ideological blocs, but exit polls and results following the count of more than 85% of the vote shows a possible victory, putting opposition leader and former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a position to become the Israeli Prime Minister again for a third time. To analyze these results, its ramifications, and what we can look forward to in the upcoming weeks, I'd like to welcome back Lahav Harkov, a returning speaker for our JCRC. Lahav is the senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post. She reports and analyzes on Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, and the Foreign Ministry, and more. She lectures on Israeli government and politics, and has been hosted by several international news outlets, including the BBC, France 24, and Sky News. Lahav is very much in demand. This is her fifth analysis that she's doing today, and I understand she has many more coming up. Lahav will speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then I will follow up with some questions and answers. Audience questions can be submitted at any time through the Q&A feature, and closed captioning is available as well. Both can be found at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to note that this program is being recorded. Lahav, welcome. Thank you for being here, as I know it's a very busy time for you. The floor is yours. What is going on in Israel today?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me back. Happy to be here. What is going on in Israel today? I'm going to jump right to the results and assume a level of background and understanding of how the system works somewhat, but it looks almost certain. I only say almost because, anything is possible, but really, I mean, Netanyahu is returning as prime minister. He has a solid majority of parties that support him. At this point, it looks like 65 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. Um, and there are a lot of different reasons that contribute to this. Between I think that his base was really galvanized this time after losing last time and having a government that they really opposed that included mostly there were two right-wing parties, or two or three depending on how you see it, but in that coalition, but most of the parties were left-wing, and one of them was an Arab party, and Netanyahu's base did not like that government. So I think that losing and really galvanized them in the sense that, like, no, we want Netanyahu back. And that also was what brought the high turnout. And I think that there was like a sense of grievance that these right-wing parties would even dare to go and join a coalition that's not right-wing. So a lot of voters from those parties left those parties. I mean, and 2 out of 3 of them, one of them is just erased off the map completely. That's the Yamina party that was led by former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. The other one, New Hope, merged into a centrist party. And so their Knesset members are still in the Knesset, but as a political group, they no longer exist. And then there's Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu, which is still in the Knesset, although they didn't do very well. So that, I think that has a lot to do with Netanyahu's victory, but he also won in part because the center to left wing was a mess. I mean, they were running as incumbents, and I think that they had achievements. I think they had positive things that they had done that they could have run on, but they weren't managing to do it. Just too much internal strife, not enough cooperation, too much ego. And I could get into the specifics of that if people are interested, but in the end they just really foundered, and a bunch of, a couple of key parties didn't pass the electoral threshold, and the Labor Party is really close to not passing the threshold. I mean, we will have the absolute final vote count, uh, what'll be tomorrow morning by you guys, and
So Lahav, you said
and
that.
so there's still a chance that Labor will drop under the threshold. I don't think they will. I think they'll have 4 seats, which is the minimum. But
Lahav, I think this is the same political party that led Israel from its existence through 1979. They used to dominate the political spectrum that may not even have enough votes to pass the threshold. I think people should realize. I mean, this is how
right, from
how much
1948
they've
to
diminished.
1977, they are
77.
they are the party. It is fair to say they are the party that founded the state, um, and the fact that they're close to disappearing, not for the first time, but I think this is their worst showing ever, is really significant. And again, if you're interested, I could get into the reasons for that, but I want to talk about who did win other than Netanyahu. So his likely coalition, it doesn't have to be his coalition, but it seems most likely. Netanyahu's coalition will be his Likud party, which is the anchor, the main right wing party in Israel. But then the other parties are Orthodox parties. You have the Haredi parties, or ultra Orthodox, although Haredim don't really like that term, so I just say Haredi. The Shas and United Torah Judaism, which had a really strong showing. They always have high turnout in those communities, but it was even higher than the last couple elections. And I think also Shas especially managed to broaden their appeal with a lot of ads that have to do with the high cost of living and high cost of food in Israel, which is, of course, an issue plaguing the whole world right now. Israel is actually doing relatively well compared to Europe and the US, but people still feel it when the price of food is higher, and so I think that that's also part of why they have more seats. And then the other party that I think everyone's talking about, sort of, you see, and I see all the foreign media and then the Jewish media, and is what's called the Religious Zionist Party, and especially it's really a block made out of 3 parties. People are especially talking about what's called Otzma Yehudit, which translates to Jewish Power, and is led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a right-wing extremist and someone known since the early 1990s, when he was a teenager already, really known media figure and provocateur of really extreme right-wing views. Some argue that he's moderated a little bit, but he's certainly as far right as you're going to get in this Knesset. Maybe he's not obliquely threatening prime ministers and things like that like he did in the 90s, but he still talks about policies of deporting quote-unquote disloyal Arab citizens of Israel. He talks about bringing back the death penalty. He's not the first and probably won't be the last to talk about these things, but he definitely has an extremely provocative style and populist style that has drawn a lot of people to him. But also, in defense of Israeli populists and to talk about just one of the things that attracted people to him is I think this has been, to use Twitter language, this was memory hold very fast. But last May, during Operation Guardian of the Walls, which was, of course, a Gaza operation when Hamas shot thousands of rockets into Israel, including all the way to Jerusalem, and then the IDF struck back at Gaza. But at the same time, there was something that hadn't happened really since the War of Independence in Israel, which is that Israeli Arabs rioted and attacked Israeli Jews, especially in mixed cities. So in the town of Lod, which is where the airport is, it might say Tel Aviv on your ticket, but you're actually going to Lod. They burned down a synagogue. In Akko, which I'm sure that many of you have visited if you visited Israel, they burned down a whole bunch of Jewish businesses and actually lynched a Jew. I mean, they literally pulled the man out of his car and killed him, like a mob of Israeli Arabs. And while this represents a small minority of the Israeli Arab population, it was deeply traumatizing to a fair number of people. And the feeling was that the police didn't address it properly, and that because of other political issues and things that came up right after, it was sort of, I wouldn't say it was swept under the rug, but it was like most of the country moved on. And I think that Ben Gvir did not move on, and he I don't even want to say he played on people's fears, because I think that he genuinely believes that you shouldn't move on and that this is a big issue. But I think that this sort of traumatizing thing that happens to people is something that really contributed to his popularity. So it's not just people who are going around saying, I hate Arabs, I want to deport them. It's people who are saying we need someone who needs to be tough because they came and killed someone on my street. They torched 100 cars in my neighborhood, etc. I think it's important just to understand this phenomenon, and I just think that definitely not justifying it in any way, but I think that it's important to understand where it's coming from and not just to have the outrage out there, which the outrage we see a lot of. So Netanyahu's coalition, most likely coalition, is going to involve the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties and then the Religious Zionist Party. These are all also parties that are Orthodox and that support the status quo in religion and state in Israel, which, as I'm sure a lot of you know, you have freedom of religion in Israel. You can be a conservative or Reform Jew, but there is no separation of religion and state in Israel. So Israel funds Orthodox Jewish services as the official religious services of the state, and not, for example, conservative or Reform Judaism, or evangelical Christianity. They do fund Orthodox Christian churches, for example, or they fund a lot of Muslim religious services as well. But for the Jewish Community Relations Council, I think the concern is mostly what's going on in the Jewish community. So any movement on, safer or better sort of egalitarian section at the Western Wall, more flexibility on what kind of conversions will be accepted, Jewish conversions in Israel.
I think it's Lahav.
You're not going to have that.
I think it's also important to note that, we're pro-Israel advocates. We're concerned about the Jewish community and pluralism. We're also concerned about the treatment of Israeli minorities. We're concerned about Israel's democracy as well as Israel's security. So it's a variety of things.
I mean, in terms of religious services in Israel, though, in terms of like what is a political issue for Israeli Arabs and Muslims, the religious services are not very controversial there. Certainly nowhere near the way they are, well, for American Jews, let's say. In Israel, also, it's not like a huge vote-getting issue, and I think that that's something that's often hard for American Jews to hear. But in Israel, it's like, if you're a secular Jew, you're a secular Jew. You're usually not actually looking for a conservative or Reform synagogue, and you almost never want to go to the Western Wall. And so it's like, while most secular Israelis wouldn't be opposed to more pluralism in the religious services in Israel, most of them just like, it's just not a vote-getting issue. And so that's also been why, even when there's more liberal governments in Israel, it's still hard to make a lot of progress. But in this government, there will be no progress. I mean, there's just no way. But I want to say there's also an alternative that Netanyahu can turn to. There is what's now called the National Unity Party, but before it was called Blue and White, led by Defense Minister Benny Gantz. Historically, Netanyahu has often tried to build a coalition that leaves out the extreme right and includes a moderate party. If he chooses to do that now, then Gantz has promised he won't sit with Netanyahu, but he's also broken that promise in the past, and everybody's been breaking their promises in this crazy 5-election cycle. And to me, it seems that it's possible that Gantz can be pressured by, if you don't come in and save the day, then we're going to have this extremist Ben Gvir in our government. So that's something to look out for as like an alternate coalition. The reason I choose specifically Gantz out of the entire anti-Netanyahu bloc is because he's basically the only one, he and his party, who would be able to work with the Haredim, who don't have a very sort of secularist agenda that the Haredim would refuse to sit with him. And Netanyahu's not going to give up on the Haredim because they're very loyal to him. So that's my, in a nutshell, of where we are right now. I know you wanted that in 15 minutes, so let's go to questions.
That was a fantastic summation, Lahav. Thank you very much. One question is, let's say, I mean, most So if you had to make a prediction, I think you turned your mic off. If you had to make I think you muted, okay. If you had to make a prediction whether Bibi is going to go with the right, or will try to go with Benny Gantz to create a center and the Haredi parties, as opposed to the National Religious Camp, which you said is composed of 3 different parties, what would your prediction be?
I think my prediction is that he will go to the right wing parties, and I have 2 reasons for it. First of all, the sense of betrayal among right wing Israelis when people, mainly Naftali Bennett, but in general, when parties sort of, they felt like their votes were stolen, that they gave them right wing votes and then they went to a government that wasn't a strongly right wing government. That sense of betrayal is huge among that electorate. And he might feel like he doesn't have a mandate to not have this right wing government. In addition, the even more sort of cynical view is that these parties are all longtime critics of the judiciary, and they want judicial reforms. Some of them are more general judicial reforms that are part of a normal political debate about the role of judiciary, and Israel doesn't have a constitution, and should we have a constitution, and what does that mean, etc. But some of them directly touch on the corruption cases that Netanyahu is embroiled in. He is on trial in 3 different cases of charges of corruption. Israeli law allows him to be prime minister and on trial at the same time. And certainly the cynical view and while Netanyahu doesn't admit to it, it seems likely, is that he would like some of those laws to be passed and for him to have a coalition that could give him a sort of get out of jail free card.
Would the fact that it's an ongoing case, would a change, let me ask you a question, would the change in the Knesset rules now possibly help the Bibi in his case, which he's undergoing now, or would he be governed by the old rules? Can literally
So they're different. There are different proposals. So one of the things that he's being charged for is a very murky item in the criminal code in Israel called fraud and breach of trust. Fraud is, I think, pretty straightforward. We know what fraud is.
Mm-hmm.
But breach of trust is one of these things that it's sort of like, the sense is almost like it's whatever the prosecutor decides it is, or the judge, and they want to erase that from the books. And one of the that's one of the religious Zionist party's proposals. And one of the criticisms is you can't, and they say it won't apply to Netanyahu right away. But if you're erasing something from the criminal code, then how can Netanyahu be convicted of it if it turns out he should be convicted of it, right? It doesn't really make sense. But one of the things that I think has a lot of support is what Israelis like to call the French law. There's a law in France that a president or prime minister can't be charged with corruption until they finish their term. And so Israelis want to copy that from France directly, so that like Netanyahu's trial will continue, but it won't happen until he's not prime minister anymore. Like it'll be put on hold for however many years that takes. And that is directly trying to influence the course of the trial right now.
Right.
Now Netanyahu says, like, he like jokes. He says, "Please don't help me this much," and so he sort of plays it innocent, like he doesn't. He's not involved. He's not giving any kind of tacit approval of this, but nobody's getting the message.
Right.
People in Likud and people in the other parties keep trying to save him, quote unquote, and so nobody takes Netanyahu that seriously when he's saying, "Please don't help me so much."
So one of the questions, a couple of questions, I'm trying to reframe them into one question, is what is the likelihood? Let's say that Bibi goes with the nationalist right-wing camp and doesn't form a coalition with Gantz. Although we know there's surprises have always happened in Israeli politics, so you never know. I mean, today, right? So the question becomes: how divisive is the right-wing camp within itself that it could end up falling apart and we could have new elections within 9 to 12 months?
I think that there's going to be a really interesting dynamic because Likud is going to be the moderate party in a coalition like that, the right religious coalition. Likud will be the moderate party in the coalition. And that has not been the case in a long time. It's been the Likudniks. So the other thing about Likud that you have to know is that they're one of the few political parties in Israel that actually holds a primary. They're very democratic in that way. They have over 100,000 members, and those people choose who's going to be in the Knesset. But while I think that's a positive overall, it's a net positive, it does also encourage a level of populism in the Likud that you don't always see in other parties. And when there's a party that's more moderate than Likud, then Likudniks can propose all kinds of populist and sometimes even extreme things. And there'll be someone else out there to stop it. But they can say to the constituents when they have a primary, look, I tried to do this and this and this. I think that Likud is now going to have to play the role of stopping other parties from doing things. And there are people in Likud who are more socially liberal. There's a very senior member of Likud who did very well in the primaries. His name's Amir Ohana. He was Israel's public security minister, so in charge of police, and he was also briefly justice minister in like a in between elections kind of thing. Amir Ohana, and he's gay and the son of twins who were born through a surrogate, and he's married to a man. Wasn't married in Israel because that's not allowed in Israel, but yeah. So, and there are others, there are plenty of secular people.
You know about the former deputy foreign minister?
No, I'm talking about someone in Likud.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, you're
okay.
the current deputy foreign minister. I mean, soon to be former. He's in Yair Lapid's party. Yes,
right.
No, Amir Ohana has been in Likud since 2015, and he was a minister. And he's gay, and he's for, of course, gay rights, and it's you'll have people like that, or you have people who are secular, or people who are more for sort of individual rights, and I think that those people are going to feel a need to make their voices be heard. And at the end of the day, there are Orthodox people who vote Likud. There's plenty of Orthodox people who vote Likud, but they're not an Orthodox party, and I don't think that the average Likud voter is going to want extreme social conservatism of the kind that you see from the other parties in that likely coalition. I don't think they're going to want that.
Do you think Likud, you're thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, you're thinking that most of the Likudniks are really what we would at least call right wing? It really comes to do with external security and foreign policy, not domestic policy, and would look at umbrage at civil liberty restrictions, for example.
Yes, I mean, in Israel, when people talk about right and left, they're almost entirely talking about basically how the Palestinian issue should be addressed. The further you get to the right, the fewer concessions of land you want. The further you get to the left, the more concessions of land you want. Like, that's basically what right and left means in Israel. It's shifting maybe a bit, especially because like the main question of Israeli politics for the past 4 years has been yes Bibi, no Bibi, but I do think, I mean, like if you're talking about like in an American sort of, from an American perspective, like I do think that most of the Likudniks are sort of moderate to moderate conservative on social issues, whereas these Orthodox parties would be extremely socially conservative.
So Mindy Stein asks an interesting question. It says, recently the United Arab Emirates Foreign Minister warned Netanyahu not to include right-wing policies such as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in any new government. But if he does and includes them, what do you think is do you think it'll likely have any impact on the Abraham Accords or the ability of Israel to bring more nations into that circle of peace? I mean, there's been talk that the Israelis are about a year away from perhaps establishing a relationship with Saudi Arabia and others, so which would be incredibly beneficial. So how likely do you think the inclusion of some of these folks in the coalition might impact Israel's attempt to enlarge the circle of Arab allies or even Arab states that they're at peace with?
I think that it depends less on whether Ben-Gvir is a minister than what he actually does. And so I would say like wait and see on that, but these ministers, the politicians in these countries that have new relations with Israel, they're still very influenced by sort of what you see in the news in the Arab world about Israel. Um, Not very influenced to the extent that there's been a real significant harm done to the Abraham Accords, but they still sort of, many of them don't really understand that the picture that they're seeing in their media of Israel is very distorted, and that if they want to know what's going on, they should try to talk to Israel and hear Israel's side before they, release all sorts of statements condemning Israel. If Ben Gvir is public security minister, which means he's in charge of police, that's something he wants to do. Being in charge of police includes border control, which has, deals with Palestinians almost every day. Every day, I don't know why I said almost. Then there's a possibility that he could do things that are sort of deeply controversial and could cause friction.
Yeah, Axios reported today that some privately, that while the statements from the Biden administration have been, we respect Israeli democracy and we look forward to working with the next government and so forth and so on, have also been, apparently there's been some talk that Secretary Blanket, our Secretary of State here, has said that, there will be ministers that the American government will not meet with in the event if they are of a type they don't consider appropriate.
Yeah, I saw that story. I think, I mean, how much does the public security minister meet with Americans anyway? Maybe there'll be like one meeting every few years with the Homeland Security Secretary, and so then that won't happen. So I think that's like it's a way for the Biden administration to sort of check the box that like they said something, but like the actual relations that they would have between those two sides would probably be somewhat limited in any case. And I think that rather than it being on the ministerial level, I think that when you share intelligence or, best practices on fighting terrorism, it's the police to the police, or the, defense ministry to the Pentagon, and it's not really him. So I think that it's the damage to U.S.-Israel ties will be different if there is damage. I think that organizations like yours and other pro-Israel organizations are gonna, they'll have a greater challenge sort of defending and explaining what's going on in Israel, and that's going to be tough. I think people who are already very critical of Israel will be armed with sort of more things to say. But in terms of the actual like day-to-day relations between the countries and the governments, chances are Ben Gvir's not going to be in a position where if he's being snubbed, it's going to actually change something on the ground.
Right. Why do you think, what are the reasons behind and this comes from a couple of questions combined, why do you think the left and the center perform so poorly in Israel today? I've heard, people refer to Israel as a choice between the right and the center, and that there's almost no left to speak of. And for a country, like you said, for the Labor Party, which founded Israel, basically and birthed it until 1977, until the collapse until their collapse and the rise of Likud. My question is that, forget about Labor right now in the foreseeable future ever forming a majority bloc, but we're talking about not even surviving. Even Meretz, I don't even know if they made the threshold, or if they're they didn't make the threshold. All right, so that must be the first time in how many elections? But so the question is, why has the left failed to gain even enough steam to maintain a presence, or a decent presence in the Knesset at this time?
So, first of all, you have the sort of root reason, I guess, for the past 20
The root what? I'm
years.
sorry, the root what?
The root cause for the left not doing as well in the past 24 years or so, which is just that the Oslo Accords blew up, right? Not days after the Oslo Accords were signed, literally, right? There were bus bombings all over Israel. 1999, Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians 97% of the West Bank and to divide Jerusalem, and they said no, and then we had the second Intifada. Ariel Sharon, who came from the right, and then moved, I guess, to the center, unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. We got thousands of rockets from Gaza. Obviously, I'm telling the story in a one-sided way, but you have to understand that many, many people view it that way. And so they view the left wing, or what was traditionally the left wing position on Israel's national security, as a failure. That's how it started.
Mhm.
Once you were there, um, so labor used to be, labor in the days of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres was a party that it was a large party, and there was tension within the party between hawks and doves. And there would be, the hawks usually won on security issues, but the doves would sometimes win on social issues, and you would have that variety. Over time, the Hawks have left the party. I mean, they're
Mhm.
just gone. And honestly, I think that Benny Gantz and his party is sort of what the Labor Hawks once
So the
were.
reincarnation of the
Right. The people, and
of,
I'm not the first to say it, like
yeah,
of that he's Yitzhak Rabin-esque in his positions
right.
in
So
the combination. But I think that labor, and even more so Meretz, have more and more appealed to like a niche group of like left-wing activists with issues that like the average Israeli doesn't care about. I mean, the current head of the Labor Party is a woman who is famous for being a radical feminist, like maybe the most famous sort of professional feminist in Israel, for speaking to people. In Israel, it's a language that has a masculine and the feminine, and she speaks to, she tries to speak in both. She has this like way of speaking that combines the two that people find very strange. And these just aren't people's priorities. And it's not to say that like the average Israeli is anti-feminist. It's just that, like, is that the party they want to vote for? Like, these seem like niche activist issues and like not the top thing in Israel.
yeah.
And you see that a lot with, I mean, the environment and climate change is a very important issue, but Israelis feel like national security right now is a more pressing issue. It's just not a popular vote getting issue, and yet the Meretz party is obsessed with it, and they didn't pass the threshold. So I think they're not really good at appealing to voters and what voters care about right now.
Let
And
me
then the
ask.
other thing I want, yeah,
Sorry, sorry. Go ahead, please.
no, the other thing I want to add is that um, people are angry at Lapid, the head of the largest party in the center to left bloc, for saying that he didn't do enough to try to get the bloc sort of together, to get the bloc united as much as possible. Um, Merav Michaeli, who's the feminist woman who's the head of the Labor Party, she refused to merge with Meretz, even though it seemed clear that one of them or both could drop below the threshold. And Lapid could have leaned on them more, and also leaned on the Arab parties, which separated into three different parties as opposed to two. They ran as two parties last time. Um, to be united just for the sake of passing the threshold.
What role did bread and butter economics issue play in this election?
It's a really interesting. You look at polls where Israelis are asked what's the most important issue, and like that is the leading issue by far.
Mhm.
And yet, when you listen to the ad campaigns and the things people talked about, very few talked about it. Or if they did, it just wasn't the central issue.
What did they
The
talk
feeling
about in the
was,
ads?
yeah, the feeling, first of all, is once again that it's like a referendum on Bibi. You
Mhm.
know? Um, they don't like necessarily say that outright, but like Netanyahu deals with a lot of sort of grievance politics and like the elites on the left and things like that. And then on the left, they try to scare people like, was it somebody in Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party said that like female newscasters are going to have to wear head coverings if this government comes into office, like all kinds of things like that, of like trying to scare people that like, the religious extremists are going to take over and we're going to turn into Iran. So there's a lot of that, like a lot of real hysterics in the tone of on both sides. People are, on the right, you had people saying all kinds of things about like, you're not going to be able to circumcise your children anymore, which is like, that's not, like, what are you talking about? It's like it was a really weird election in that way, like really hysterical, and just like things that are not really important coming up. And that was why I had said earlier that I wouldn't be surprised if, like, once like real in-depth research is done, if Shas got a few seats for the fact that they were talking about bread and butter issues more than anyone else.
Right. I'm going to ask people if they'd like to continue to put questions in. I'm happily receiving them, and I'm trying to combine them into briefly into succinct questions so we can get a lot more of Lahav's analysis. And is there any concern that the recent maritime deal that was negotiated with Lebanon under Lapid will be canceled as a result of a potential Likud-led government, as a potential Prime Minister Netanyahu's ascendancy again?
I don't think so.
Mhm.
Netanyahu's initial reaction was, "Oh, I'm going to try to find a way to get around it," but then he started saying other things, and most recently he said he's going to treat it the way he treated the Oslo Accords. Now, what did Netanyahu do with the Oslo Accords? He actually kept to them. I mean, he did the sort of what was the next step that had been promised to the Clinton administration, which is that Israel mostly pulled out of Hebron.
Mhm.
And after that, when he was pressed to make more concessions, he said, the Palestinians need to stop terrorism, stop incitement, etc. And if they do those things that they're supposed to do in the Oslo Accords, then we'll do what we're supposed to do. With Lebanon, the thing is that the government of Lebanon, I think, won't have a hard time keeping to the terms of the deal. The problem is that there's, of course, Hezbollah, which is like a powerful terrorist organization that practically runs the country. So I don't think Netanyahu will take a first step to blow up that deal. I do think that from the get-go, it was on shaky ground because of Hezbollah.
President Herzog was in the United States this past weeks, and there were reports in the media that he was trying to assuage or calm American Jewish leaders down about the possibility of a extreme right-wing government coming to Israel and its ramifications for that. Obviously, American Jews as a whole tend to be more progressive than Israelis as a whole. I think that's a pretty generic but fair statement. Right now, we are seeing an erosion of support in the Democratic Party, or some people might not like that phraseology, or you might say we might see a more challenging of common assumptions. We have, it's come up where there should be possibly restrictions on certain weapons to Israel. It's come up that there's more comments from people about actions taken by the Israeli military. And in addition to that, you also have American Jews who are Zionist to the core, and not even progressive, but moderate, and even some on the right, who are very concerned about their ability to present Israel and the United States as countries that share democratic values. That's been in my career for 30 years. That's been the underpinning of our ability to advocate for the state of Israel. Shared democratic Israel value, the only democracy in the Middle East. How do you think the prime minister is going to be able to maneuver? And if this right-wing nationalist government, more extreme to the right, not saying the Haredi parties, but more to the nationalist parties, were to come to power, how is that, in your opinion, going to start impacting the relationship between the United States and Israel, and between Israel and American Jewry?
In some ways, I think when it comes to the United States and Israel, we're in this period of time where a lot of countries are going through what Israel just went through in its election, whether it's Sweden, Italy, even Germany recently. I mean, their election was a little while ago, but where there are these far right-wing parties that do very well in the elections, and then the ruling party sort of have to figure out how to deal with that, to either get around being with them or having them in the coalition but not having them set the tone. And so I think, first of all, I think that the Jewish community, or the pro-Israel, which is the majority of the Jewish community, it needs to try to hope that that Israel's not being treated with a double standard. At the same time, I completely understand the the sense that a lot of American Jews have that because Israel is the Jewish state, they have a responsibility to speak out when they think that Israel's going on the wrong path. And it's delicate. I think there are more effective and less effective ways of doing it, but I completely understand that feeling. Um, and so it'll be complicated. It'll be bumpy. I think this is a sign more of social trends and disappointments with the results of democracy, right? We often have governments we don't like, and then there's a swing back in an extreme way.
Mhm.
And I think that's you look at that's what Trump was, right? Like Republicans disliked the two Obama administrations so much that they swung so far in the other direction.
Right. And I asked my
And I
question
do think that there's
when I asked my questions
yeah.
out of a sincere respect for Israel's democracy and as and they are free as a democracy, of course, to choose their own leadership.
Right. So I think that in the end of the day, I mean, first of all, we have to wait and see what this government actually does as opposed to how it looks,
Right.
right? But I do think at the end of the day that's the answer is that the voters um, had an extreme reaction to a government that was not so extreme and so liberal, but or so not so left wing in terms of what it actually was able to accomplish. But that's what it is. That they saw something that was sort of like unprecedented. There was an Arab party in the coalition.
Right.
There were parties on the left and far left that had not really been in charge of anything in a long time, and the majority of Israel's right wing, and they had an extreme reaction to it. And these are things that happen in democracies. In democracies, you make a choice, and it's not always the choice that everyone thinks is the best choice.
Right.
And so, for starters, I think that's what you can say now.
I'm getting some people complaining or that the volume is hard. So Adam, I don't know if there's anything that you can do behind the scenes to help our connectivity with Lahav, or if there's anything Lahav you can do in terms of volume. People are getting it, but I think some people.
It's too soft.
Yeah, if you can make it a
People
little
can hear me?
louder. Yeah, I can hear you fine, but I think some people in our who are on who are saying who are writing in say, can anything be done to improve the volume? Okay. Yes, it's either on their end or okay. I think your volume for me is fine, so I don't know, but if there's
Yeah,
anything
I
you
don't
can.
know. I'm on maximum volume
Oh, okay. Then
for
we're
my
there. For
microphone.
most people, it's fine. Adam is telling me. Okay. So let me ask you a question. Why was there such a low Arab turnout, considering how much was at stake, and considering at state and at stake, not state, and they, because under the Lapid government, they got a huge increase in investment in the Israeli Arab sector. So
Yeah.
it's sort of, even though obviously there's differences between the two Rama and the other party, which split a lot of votes. You would think that from the Israeli Arab perspective, they would want to consolidate their votes to maximize their strengths. They have the potential to be the third largest party in Israel if they were to unify and to flex muscle. Why has that not happened?
So first of all, I think that has to be the last question, just because we're running out of time. But
Okay, thank you.
I think there are a few elements. First of all, the fact that they were willing to join the coalition was controversial in the first place. They were the first independent Arab party to join an Israeli coalition ever, and it wasn't magic, right? They were promised a lot of money. It was supposed to be over the course of several years, so it wasn't like they got 50 billion shekels right away.
Right.
But the crime rate in the Arab sector is really, really bad and a lot higher than the rest of the country. And they have an especially high murder rate, a lot of gang violence. And this is a phenomenon of like the last decade or so. Like it's gotten worse recently. That did not magically get better because Ram was in the coalition, and that's something people care about. The other thing is traditionally these parties don't want to join the coalition out of identification with the Palestinian cause. And they feel like if you join the coalition, then you're complicit. And so it's still just joining a coalition at all is still controversial in that way. That the Ram was a party that decided to be pragmatic as opposed to focusing on its on Palestinian nationalism. So that split always exists.
So
The
Lahav,
other thing I'd say,
I apologize.
yeah,
I'm trying to make sure you get to your next JFNA call. That's it.
yeah, no. So the other thing I want to say is that the different Arab parties, they did run for a while as the joint list, and it really helped them get higher numbers. They always got along really poorly. They had
Uh,
very different views.
mhm.
One of them is a communist party. Ra'am is a party that's affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They're actually very socially conservative, so you could see how that could put them at odds with communists. You have Balad, which are like extreme Arab nationalists. The founder of their party is a fugitive from Israel for giving state secrets to Hezbollah. They're all kind of in different. Arab is not necessarily a political position, and so they always had issues. And then they blew up again.
Look, thank you very much for a great discussion. It's always terrific to have you. You're one of the best speakers we ever have. Who always provided such extraordinary analysis and insight. I guess we will wait to see what happens with the Israeli government, and we will see you. Hopefully, you'll speak for us again soon to give us an update. And we want to thank all our viewers and listeners for joining us, and to wish them a great day and enjoy your rest of the week. And again, Lahav, thank you so much for doing this for us. Best wishes.
Thank you.